Margaret stood at the supermarket exit, her eyes burning from pepper spray. The chemical agent seared her vision, bringing tears streaming down her weathered face. This woman, who had once treated hundreds of soldiers across 3 wars, was now being treated like a common thief. Her trembling hand clutched her veteran ID card, knuckles white with tension. "Stay where you are," shouted the young security guard, his voice cracking with misplaced authority. He gripped her arm roughly, unconcerned about the pain evident in her expression. Margaret struggled to maintain her composure, her military training kicking in despite the searing pain. She controlled her breathing. 3 counts in, 3 counts out, just as she taught wounded soldiers in field hospitals. Around them, shoppers formed a hesitant circle. Some pulled out phones to record a confrontation, but no one stepped forward to help. The guard's uniform and confident demeanor created an illusion of legitimacy that kept bystanders at bay. "I didn't take anything," Margaret managed to say between controlled breaths, her voice steady despite the pain. "That's what they all say," the guard sneered, tightening his grip. "We have you on camera, acting suspicious, watching everything." Classic shoplifter behavior. Margaret's shoulders remained square despite the pain, her posture betraying decades of military discipline even as the pepper spray continued its assault on her senses. The guard dragged her toward the back of the store, oblivious to the dignity of the woman he was manhandling. "You're making a terrible mistake," she said quietly, but her words fell on deaf ears. Just 30 minutes earlier, Margaret Wilson had been carefully selecting items from the store shelves, her movements deliberate and efficient. At 70, her body carried the invisible weight of her 30 years of military service. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a simple navy blue blouse with pressed khaki pants. The only hint of her military background was the modest veteran's cap she wore, embroidered with U.S. Army Medical Corps. Margaret had joined the Army as a nurse during Vietnam, when most women her age were starting families. She'd risen through the ranks, eventually becoming a respected combat medic who served in Vietnam, the Gulf War, and later Iraq. Her hands, now showing signs of arthritis, had once performed emergency surgeries under enemy fire, saved countless lives, and comforted the dying when nothing else could be done. Today was supposed to be simple: groceries for the week, then preparations for tonight's Veterans Support Group meeting. She founded the group 5 years ago after noticing how many female veterans struggled to find recognition and support. As she selected a carton of eggs, checking each one carefully for cracks, her right knee ached, a reminder of shrapnel from a mortar attack outside Baghdad in 2003. She shifted her weight, accommodating the old injury without complaint, just as she'd done for years. Margaret moved through the store with the situational awareness that had become second nature during her service, noting exits, observing other shoppers, scanning her surroundings. She didn't realize that these same behaviors, born from years in combat zones, were being misinterpreted by the store's inexperienced security team. She paid for her groceries with exact change, thanked the cashier with a warm smile, and headed for the exit, completely unaware of the confrontation awaiting her. The neighborhood market had been plagued by a series of thefts over the past month. 6 incidents of shoplifting, primarily involving health and beauty products, had put management on high alert. The store manager had called an emergency meeting that morning, pressuring the security team to produce results. "I don't care how you do it. Just catch these people," he'd instructed the staff, his face flushed with frustration. "Our quarterly loss prevention numbers are terrible." Jason, the 23-year-old security guard who had been hired just 3 weeks earlier, felt the weight of this responsibility acutely. With minimal training and a desperate desire to prove himself, he'd spent the morning watching the security monitors with heightened anxiety. When the latest theft report came in, describing a senior woman who had allegedly slipped expensive medications into her purse, Jason was determined to be vigilant. The description was vague at best. Older woman, gray hair, moves slowly. Not much to go on, but enough to put him on edge. Margaret's methodical shopping patterns caught his attention immediately. The way she scanned each aisle before entering, how she observed other customers, her efficient movements. To Jason's untrained eye, these looked like the calculated behaviors of someone planning a theft. "Got a possible suspect on aisle 7, he murmured into his radio. Older woman, acting suspicious. From a security room, the shift supervisor barely glanced at the monitor before responding. "Keep an eye on her. If she makes a move, don't let her leave the store." Jason watched as Margaret completed her shopping and proceeded through checkout. When she paid and received her receipt, he frowned in confusion but remained convinced of his suspicions. "She's smart," he thought. "Probably paid for some items to avoid suspicion while hiding others." As Margaret headed for the exit, Jason moved to intercept her. "Excuse me, ma'am. I need you to come with me," Jason announced, stepping directly into Margaret's path. His hand rested conspicuously on the pepper spray canister attached to his belt. Margaret stopped, her military training automatically assessing the young man blocking her way. His stance, his nervous energy, the way his eyes darted around. She recognized insecurity masked by aggression. "Is there a problem?" she asked calmly, her voice carrying the natural authority developed through decades of commanding medical units. "Store security. We have reason to believe you concealed merchandise," Jason stated, reciting the phrase from his training manual. "I need to check your bags and personal belongings." Margaret straightened her posture, standing at her full height despite the pain in her knee. "Young man, I've paid for everything in my possession. Here's my receipt." She held out the paper, her hand steady. Jason barely glanced at it. "That doesn't prove anything. We need to search your bags and purse." Several customers had stopped to watch the confrontation. Margaret noticed them but maintained her focus on the guard. "I understand you're doing your job, but I haven't taken anything. I'd like to speak with your manager before submitting to any search," she said firmly, her tone reflecting years of handling crisis situations. Jason's face flushed. "So you can hide whatever you took?" "No way." His hand moved to her arm, gripping it tightly. "You veterans think you're special, above the rules, always demanding respect without earning it." The insult struck Margaret like a physical blow. She pulled her arm away, wincing as a sudden movement aggravated her old injuries. "Do not touch me. I've done nothing wrong," she said, turning toward the store entrance where she'd seen the manager's office. Jason panicked, interpreting her movement as an attempt to flee. Without warning, he unholstered his pepper spray and discharged it directly into Margaret's face. The burning was instantaneous and overwhelming. Margaret gasped, her hands instinctively rising to protect her eyes as decades of battlefield discipline fought against the body's natural panic response. "Got her," Jason announced triumphantly, grabbing her arm again as she struggled to remain standing. Through the burning haze, Margaret felt herself being roughly guided through the store. The pepper spray's effects were particularly severe on her 70-year-old skin and eyes. Each breath became a struggle as the chemical agent inflamed her airways, aggravating the respiratory issues she developed after years of exposure to burn pits in Iraq. Jason pushed her into a small room at the back of the store, a cramped office with a metal table, 2 chairs, and harsh fluorescent lighting. The door closed behind them with an ominous click. "Sit down," he ordered, pushing her toward a chair. Margaret remained standing, years of military bearing preventing her from yielding to his intimidation despite her distress. "I need water and a clean cloth," she stated, her voice hoarse but commanding. "Pepper spray can cause serious damage, especially to older individuals." "You'll get nothing until we resolve the situation," Jason replied, circling her like a predator. "Maybe this will teach you not to steal." "I'm a retired Army colonel with the Medical Corps." Margaret managed between painful breaths. "I understand the effects of chemical agents. Denying basic first aid is unacceptable." Jason scoffed. "Right, and I'm the Secretary of Defense. Lady, save your stories." Margaret's eyes streamed with involuntary tears as the capsaicin continued its assault. She treated soldiers exposed to chemical weapons and knew the proper protocols. Protocols this untrained young man was ignoring, using techniques developed in field hospitals. She controlled her breathing and tried to minimize eye movement. Her hands, once steady enough to perform emergency surgery under artillery fire, now trembled slightly as she reached for the edge of the table to stabilize herself. "My son will be looking for me," she said calmly. "He's expecting me at 1300. That's 1 p.m. in civilian time." Another lie. Jason muttered, unmoved by her obvious distress. The store manager, Mr. Barton, entered the room 15 minutes later. In his mid-40s, with thinning hair and an ill-fitting suit, he carried himself with the exaggerated importance of someone who had finally achieved minimal authority. He surveyed Margaret with cold eyes, showing no concern for her condition. The pepper spray had left her face red and swollen, her eyes bloodshot and tearing continuously. "So, this is our shoplifter," he stated rather than asked, settling into the chair across from her. "Jason says you were exhibiting classic theft behaviors." "I paid for everything in my basket," Margaret replied, her voice strained but dignified. "Your security guard assaulted me without provocation or evidence." Barton smiled thinly. "We have security footage of you watching the aisles, observing other customers, checking exits. Textbook shoplifting preparation." "That's called situational awareness," Margaret explained. "Standard practice for anyone with military training." The manager exchanged a skeptical glance with Jason. "Ah, yes, the military story. Jason mentioned you were claiming to be some sort of veteran." "I served 30 years in the Army Medical Corps," Margaret stated firmly. "I retired as a colonel after 3 combat deployments." Barton leaned back, making no effort to hide his disbelief. "You know what I find interesting? How many veterans we catch stealing, always using their supposed service as an excuse." Margaret's expression remained composed, though the insult cut deeply. "In my experience, those who've truly served rarely mention it unless necessary." "Like you're doing now?" Barton countered with a smirk. "Only because you question my integrity," she replied evenly. "Empty your purse," Barton demanded, pushing a plastic bin toward her. With deliberate movements, Margaret opened her modest handbag and removed its contents: a wallet, keys, reading glasses, a small pill organizer, and a phone. "Where are the medications you took?" Jason interjected. "I didn't take any medications," Margaret responded, the pain in her eyes intensifying from both the pepper spray and the baseless accusations. "Search her again," Barton instructed Jason. "These veteran types often have special hiding places. Check her clothing." Margaret stood straighter, her military bearing unmistakable despite her distress. "You will do no such thing without proper cause or authority." The standoff continued for another 20 minutes. Margaret's request for water and a towel to alleviate the pepper spray's effects were repeatedly ignored. The burning sensation had diminished slightly, but left her skin raw and her eyes painfully irritated. "My son will be arriving soon to pick me up," Margaret stated, glancing at the clock on the wall. "He's a military man as well. Perhaps you'll find his credentials more convincing." Barton rolled his eyes. "Of course, the imaginary military son coming to rescue mommy. Very creative. Colonel Margaret Wilson, U.S. Army Medical Corps, service number 385-42-7891, she recited calmly. "You can verify my identity with a simple phone call." "Lady, do you know how many veterans come through here claiming special treatment?" Barton's voice dripped with condescension. "Last week, some guy claimed he was a Navy SEAL. Turned out he'd never even served." Margaret nodded slowly. "Stolen valor is a serious issue. Those who falsely claim military service dishonor those who actually served and sacrificed." "Exactly," Jason chimed in, missing her point entirely. "Like what you're doing now." Margaret's hands rested calmly on the table, though the arthritis in her fingers, aggravated by stress, caused her noticeable discomfort. She'd endured far worse than this small indignity. In Baghdad, she'd operated on wounded soldiers for 18 hours straight during a sandstorm with limited supplies. In Vietnam, she'd evacuated a field hospital under enemy fire, carrying patients to safety. This petty harassment was nothing compared to those trials, but the injustice of it stung nonetheless. "I understand you're doing your job," she said evenly, "but you're making a serious error in judgment, one that could have significant consequences for both you and this establishment." Barton laughed dismissively. "Is that a threat, ma'am?" "No," Margaret replied quietly. "It's an observation based on experience." The door opened, and a woman in her 30s entered the room. Her name tag identified her as Sarah Miller assistant manager. She carried a clipboard and stopped short when she saw Margaret's condition. "What's going on here?" she asked, her eyes widening at Margaret's reddened face and irritated eyes. "Caught a shoplifter," Barton stated flatly. "She's being uncooperative." Sarah looked at Margaret more carefully, noting the veteran's cap on the table among her belongings. "Has anyone given her water or a towel for her face? Pepper spray effects need to be treated promptly." "She's fine," Jason muttered, "just playing for sympathy." Sarah's expression hardened. She left briefly and returned with a bottle of water and a clean, damp towel, which she offered to Margaret. "Thank you," Margaret said, accepting both gratefully. She applied the cool towel to her face, the relief immediate but incomplete. "Mrs.," Sarah began. "Colonel Wilson," Margaret corrected gently, "though I'm retired now." Sarah nodded respectfully. "Colonel Wilson, can you tell me what happened?" Before Margaret could answer, Barton interrupted. "We don't need to go through this again." Jason caught her acting suspiciously. She resisted questioning, and now she's claiming to be military to gain sympathy. Sarah held up her hand. "I'd like to hear from her directly, please." Margaret explained the situation concisely, her military training evident in her clear, factual account. She described her shopping payment and the unprovoked confrontation at the exit. Sarah listened attentively, her expression growing increasingly concerned. "Did anyone actually see her conceal merchandise? Do we have any evidence beyond suspicious behavior?" Jason shifted uncomfortably. "Well, not exactly, but..." "And did you check her receipt against her purchases before using pepper spray?" Sarah continued. "She was trying to leave," Jason protested weakly. Sarah turned back to Margaret. "You mentioned your son has come to pick you up?" Margaret nodded. "Major James Wilson. He should be arriving any minute now." "Major Wilson?" Sarah's eyebrows rose. "Of the 10th Mountain Division?" Margaret looked surprised. "Yes. Do you know my son?" "My brother served under him in Afghanistan," Sarah replied quietly. "He speaks very highly of the Major." The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly. The door swung open with military precision. Major James Wilson stood in the doorframe, his 6 feet 2 inches frame filling the entrance. Though in civilian clothes, a crisp button-down shirt and pressed slacks, his military bearing was unmistakable. His posture, haircut, and the way he surveyed the room with a quick, analytical gaze all marked him as a career soldier. His eyes found his mother immediately, widening at the sight of her reddened face and irritated eyes. For a brief moment, raw emotion flashed across his features before military discipline reasserted itself. "Mom," he said, his voice controlled but tight with restrained anger. "What happened?" Before Margaret could answer, Barton stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mr. Wilson, I'm the manager here. There seems to have been a misunderstanding." The major ignored the outstretched hand. "That's Major Wilson. And I'm asking my mother what happened." Margaret explained the situation succinctly, her voice steady despite her obvious discomfort. As she spoke, her son's expression hardened, his jaw tightening with each detail. When she finished, Major Wilson turned to face Barton and Jason. "You pepper sprayed a 70-year-old woman because she looked suspicious? Without evidence? Without checking her receipt?" Jason swallowed hard, suddenly aware of the gravity of his actions. "Sir, she was resisting." "Stop talking," the major commanded, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "My mother has never stolen anything in her life. She was a combat medic who saved hundreds of lives across 3 wars. He reached into his pocket and withdrew his phone. With a few taps, he pulled up a photograph and held it before them. The image showed a younger Margaret in combat fatigues, treating a wounded soldier amid what appeared to be a desert battlefield. "This is my mother in Iraq, 2003, treating casualties after a roadside bombing. She continued working despite being wounded herself." He scrolled to another image, Margaret receiving a medal, her uniform adorned with numerous ribbons and commendations. "And this is my mother receiving the Bronze Star with Valor for her actions that day. The same woman you just assaulted and accused of petty theft." The room fell silent as the reality of their mistake dawned on Barton and Jason. Major Wilson wasn't finished. He pulled out his mother's military ID card and a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. Colonel Margaret Wilson served for 30 years in the Army Medical Corps. Vietnam, Gulf War, Iraq. She was one of the first female combat medics to receive the Purple Heart. He opened the velvet box, revealing the distinctive purple and gold medal, awarded after she was wounded by shrapnel while evacuating patients under enemy fire. Sarah, the assistant manager, looked at the medal with reverence. My brother told me about a female medic who saved his platoon mate's life in Afghanistan. Said she performed an emergency procedure during a firefight that no one else would attempt. Margaret nodded modestly. Tension pneumothorax. The boy had a collapsed lung. Nothing heroic, just doing my job. Major Wilson's voice remained controlled, but his eyes burned with intensity. My mother founded a support group for female veterans suffering from PTSD. She volunteers at the VA hospital 3 days a week. She mentors young women entering military medical service. Jason had backed himself against the wall, his face pale. Barton stood frozen, unable to meet anyone's gaze. And today, the major continued, she was assaulted, falsely accused, denied basic first aid, and treated with contempt. All because she carried herself with a situational awareness that kept her and her patients alive in combat zones. He turned to his mother, his voice softening. Mom, do you need medical attention? Your eyes look severely irritated. Margaret shook her head slightly. I've had worse in training exercises, but I would appreciate some proper decontamination supplies. Major Wilson turned back to face Barton, his expression unyielding. Here's what happens next. My mother needs immediate medical attention for her eyes and respiratory system. Pepper spray can cause serious complications, especially in older adults with prior respiratory exposure to burn pits. Barton nodded quickly. Of course, we'll call an ambulance right away. Already done, the major replied. What I want from you now is accountability. Sarah stepped forward. I'll gather the security footage and file an incident report immediately. Good. Major Wilson acknowledged, but this goes beyond paperwork. Your employee assaulted my mother without cause, denied her medical attention, and subjected her to discriminatory treatment based on age and veteran status. Barton began stammering apologies, but the major cut him off. I don't want your apologies. I want action. First, the security guard is terminated immediately. Second, your store implements mandatory training on respectful treatment of veterans and elderly customers. Third, a formal written apology from corporate headquarters. Jason looked stricken. Please, I need this job. I was just following. Following what? Major Wilson interrupted. Not protocol. Not training. Not common decency. You followed your bias and prejudice. Margaret placed a gentle hand on her son's arm. James, she said softly, perhaps this young man needs guidance rather than punishment. The major looked at his mother with a mixture of respect and exasperation. Even after being mistreated, her instinct was to teach rather than condemn. Fine, he conceded. Instead of termination, reassignment to a non-security role, contingent upon completion of proper training and community service hours at the Veteran Center. Barton nodded vigorously. Yes, absolutely. And I'll personally ensure the training program is implemented company-wide. See that you do, Major Wilson replied, because this incident isn't over. How you respond now determines whether this becomes a teaching moment or a legal matter. 3 weeks later, Margaret sat at the head table during the monthly meeting of her female veterans support group. The attendance had doubled since the incident, which had gone viral after a customer's video hit social media. The response has been overwhelming, Margaret told the assembled women, many of whom had served in various branches across different eras. What happened to me was unfortunate, but it's created an opportunity to address larger issues facing veterans, particularly women who served. The supermarket chain had responded with comprehensive changes. They'd implemented a veterans awareness training program for all employees, created a special hiring initiative for veterans, and made a substantial donation to the local VA hospital's women's health program. Jason, the former security guard, sat quietly at the back of the room. As part of his community service, He was helping with administrative tasks for the veterans group. The experience had been humbling and educational. He'd learned that Margaret had saved lives in situations he couldn't imagine, yet never wore her accomplishments as a shield or weapon. The most important lesson, Margaret continued, addressing the group, is that recognition isn't about special treatment. It's about acknowledging the unique perspectives and challenges veterans bring back to civilian life. She gestured toward a display of photographs showing women in various military roles across decades. Our service often goes unrecognized. Female veterans are frequently invisible in civilian society, but that's changing, and each of us has a role in that change. Major Wilson, sitting beside his mother, watched with pride as she transformed a personal injustice into a platform for positive change. The incident had sparked a regional conversation about how female veterans were perceived and treated. Several news outlets had picked up the story, leading to a series of features on women who had served. Margaret had used her unexpected spotlight to highlight the contributions of other female veterans rather than focus on her own accomplishments. "We don't serve for recognition," she told the group, "but recognition helps ensure that future generations of women who serve won't face the same barriers we did." The room erupted in applause, with several women wiping away tears. Have you ever misjudged someone based on appearance? Share your thoughts in the comments below. How can we better recognize and respect veterans, especially women who served? Your perspectives matter in this important conversation. Remember, respect isn't just about what we say. It's about how we treat people every day.